Queerness in Scotland has always existed, hidden in medieval manuscripts, coded in Jacobite poetry, or expressed through the arts. We're going to explore some of the queer art and artists from Scottish history and the societies in which they lived. This is Queer Scotland. Some of the first instances of queerness in Scotland are in our folklore.
Being a Celtic kind of nation and having those connections to stories that go back a really, really long way, maybe even pre-Christianity, means that there's this really deep and rich trove of stories. So everything from the Sealy Court to selkies to all kinds of strange watery creatures, things that transform, is very much in the blood of Scottish history and storytelling. LGBTQ plus people have drawn from mythical creatures for a long time. If you look at the terms like fairy and unicorn that we use in the LGBTQ plus society, like these are terms that are coded in mythology and folklore.
Poem 49, published in 1586, is a rare example of lesbian verse written in Scots, showing us that queerness did exist in early Scottish art. Art allowed queer artists to reveal their true selves, the truth that they had to hide from society. Scottish artist Gavin Hamilton's painting, Achilles lamenting the death of Patroclus, has hidden depths. It's unmistakably homoerotic, but has often been misinterpreted as friendship, erasing the queer love.
When you walk up to this painting, it is large, it is impressive, but I find it rather slightly camp. There's something about the neoclassical that I think is a bit amdram, but you really get a clear signal from this painting. It is a moment of grief. And you can see that in this painting, the way that Achilles has posed himself. He's holding off all the men and their spears and their armor clustered around him, trying to clamber in, but he's sort of saying, stand back. This is a grief that only I understand. This is a grief that is for me. This is what this painting is telling you about. It is about deep, deep grief.
By the mid-19th century, queer voices and artists in Scotland were starting to become more visible and their lives more open. But then, in 1885, the Criminal Law Amendment Act made sexual acts between men a criminal offence, forcing many to hide once again. After the Second World War, Scotland's queer community found new forms of visibility and expression. Artists like the two Roberts forged their own path in a still hostile society.
These are two men who met at university, who spent their lives together, most of their lives together, and they created their artwork together. To the point, it's sometimes hard to tell which one has painted which painting. There are moments where the styles are so overlapping or shared, or sometimes they're working on the same piece together. It's difficult to pull them apart. So it really is a product of the two of them. Their exploration of Cubism, so Cubism obviously coming into vogue after Pablo Picasso, kind of bringing this into a new way of looking at art, a new way of creating art. But it was a rebellious movement as well. And so these two gay men are using this fresh, new perspective of painting and creating to create their work.
If you look at the context in which they were living, and it's the 40s and 50s, we're looking at a time when it was still very difficult to be homosexual in Scotland, in the UK generally as well.
While some artists bravely embraced queer themes in their work, others, also living and creating in Scotland, chose to keep their identities concealed.
Joan Eardley lived in Cataline in Scotland between 1952 and 1963. And while she was there, she painted a lot of very intense seascapes. And whilst she didn't paint things that were overtly queer or overtly about her personal life, the emotions that you sense in her paintings are quite strong. And often in her archives and in her letters, she talks about the way in which her love life is going and how that's affecting her painting. So there is this sort of underlying feeling that it's touching on her queer personal life, even if it isn't overt in depictions of queerness.
Amid the silence and suppression, some actively rallied for political and societal change. Bob and Sigrid opened Lavender Menace, Scotland's first queer bookshop in Edinburgh in the late 1970s.
It was a kind of liberation that was about visibility in ordinary life.
Books are really important for reaching out to people's identities, and that's one of the reasons that we were doing it.
I knew one person who took 5 times to actually get into the bookshop. It was a big step to walk through that door. But once inside, they did feel safe. And one person said to me that it was the only place she felt safe in Edinburgh as a teenager. It was a place where every one of the books and all the people in the shop were affirming and accepted you.
In 1981, Scotland finally decriminalised homosexuality, marking a significant step forward in queer rights. But just 7 years later, Section 28 of the Local Government Act was introduced, banning schools from discussing LGBTQ+ topics and fueling a new wave of censorship and artistic repression. Glaswegian visual artist and playwright Maud Salter was way ahead of her time.
In Maud Salter's Urania, there are so many fascinating aspects to this image and this photographic series. The thing that strikes me the most is actually the sitter being a queer woman and artist, Lubena Hamid.
She's trying to place the black figure into a position where they weren't traditionally placed in art history as a central figure. I really think it's quite powerful, but if you actually start to think about what she's holding and the stars that you see, and if you think about the night sky and the idea of stars as fixed marks for us to be able to navigate, it becomes really interesting. Because if you want to think about the idea of an immigrant or a migrant, somebody who has traveled from one place to another and has claimed a new place as home, it can be confusing when you look up in the sky. The stars aren't where you expect them to be.
Moving into the 21st century, Scotland became a welcoming place for the queer creative community. The 2004 Gender Recognition Act was a milestone for trans rights in Scotland. Edinburgh-based playwright and performer Jo Clifford's play Queen of Heaven played a huge part in trans representation in the wider arts scene.
Jo Clifford's Jesus Queen of Heaven is a one-woman show that reimagines the figure of Jesus Christ as a trans woman. Jo's reinterpretation of Jesus Christ as a trans woman is a really radical reimagining, but it's not incomprehensible to me. And I think what it does is it draws a direct connection between the canonical works of Jesus, water into wine, transformation, and the kind of really radical and transformative act of just like being a trans person in daily life.
In 2014, same-sex marriage was finally legalised in Scotland, yet just over 10 years later, in 2025, trans people continue to fight for recognition and equal rights.
What the transgender community has gone through in the last decade was what we were going through in the 70s. That sort of period of claiming recognition for ourselves, amongst ourselves, and then from the wider community and the media.
My wife and I introduce each other as being each other's wives now, and we could never have dreamed of introducing each other as partners back in the day. Invisibility was enforced even in our own community, but that's not true now, and it's a bit hard to get used to being seen.
Our collections are meant to represent our public. They typically don't represent the Scottish public as it is and as it has been because of patriarchal collecting practices. Having now people who are collecting and curating who are of diverse identities, who are queer, that is going to have a huge effect on the works that we're collecting and better representing the people of Scotland, which includes queer people and always has.
Queer art has always existed in Scotland, adapting and resisting through time, a history that has, until recently, been mostly hidden. Queer art has always found ways to survive, sometimes loud, sometimes concealed, but always pushing back. But what happens when the artist becomes the artwork? From self-portraits to performance, queer artists have long used their own bodies to challenge, question and reclaim. In our next episode, we explore queer bodies, because sometimes just existing is the most radical act of all.